Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We are back with Understanding Capitalism, Lecture 4 today, Economies of Scale and Scope. Towards the end of this lecture, Dr. Steele talks about monopolies, and I think it's very good to start understanding that because we see around sometimes, especially in modern America, and we see a lot of monopolies in the country, and a lot of people think that that's a consequence of capitalism. But as Dr. Steele will show in this lecture, it's not. It's actually the opposite. A good capitalist system would encourage competition, and it needs competition in order to flourish. So that's when you actually need to try to avoid monopolies.
Yeah, it's actually the government and really the administrative branch of the government. I call it a branch just to speak about reality, not about the formal constitutional modes. But the regulations that come from these administrative bureaucracies make it very difficult for startups to get into many different sectors of the economy. There's first the regulatory burden itself of knowing and interpreting these as to how you can run your business. And then there's the cost of employing administrative lawyers to make sure that you stay in compliance, to make sure you're not violating any of these policies, and having an HR staff that can keep you apprised. All of these things make it so that large firms, even if they don't intend to be a monopoly, many do, but even if they don't intend to be a monopoly, have an advantage because of their resources and their infrastructure that allows them to support a legal team and an HR team and a PR team and government lobbyists for that matter. All of these things that make it possible to operate in a regulatory state that a startup cannot compete with.
That's right. And you have, so government and the industry actually start combining forces in order to create more and more complicated regulations that at the time of this recording, we are close to tax season just happened, and just filing my personal taxes is so complicated. Now multiply that by 1,000. And if you're a small business and you need to try to figure out all the regulations regarding labor, regarding taxes, regarding employment, those are really complicated for small businesses to be able to navigate that without violating any regulations or laws. That's something that only big companies can do.
So while Dr. Steele talks about the advantages of scale and scope for a business in terms of the efficiency in manufacturing products that satisfy their customers and meet their customers' needs, in a system of government that has departed from the original founding vision, that scale and scope actually works against smaller competitors who would otherwise have access to join the market. Now, we thank you for listening to our podcast and really appreciate you joining us and learning with us this way. I do want to put in the periodic reminder that we make videos of these courses. And while it's not always convenient to watch them, that's why you're listening to the podcast, I recommend that you go watch Lecture 4, Economies of Scale and Scope, on our website. You can access the course at hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course, because we put some really interesting animations in that illustrate what Dr. Steele is talking about at a few points in this lecture. He has a fantastic example, and we animated it for your viewing pleasure. So go to hillsdale.edu/course and take a look. For now,
let's go to Dr. Steele in Lecture 4 of Understanding Capitalism, Economies of Scale and Scope.
Welcome to Lecture 4. We have seen previously how profit and loss signals identify which activities create net value, and how this incentivizes people to direct capital to those activities. In this lesson, we'll study this more carefully and examine some of the consequences of capitalism for human flourishing. We will also look at threats against the system that can arise from regulation, government interference with the system, and also attempts by less scrupulous businessmen to use lawfare or regulation to gain special privileges and protection from competition. When economic activities are governed entirely by voluntary trade and profit and loss, the overwhelming tendency is for capital and factors of production to flow to those projects that create the most net value. And it incentivizes the discovery and innovation of these things. The development of new and previously unimagined ways of meeting human needs. The result is unparalleled growth in the modern economy and civilization. Let's examine in more detail how this occurs. We know that voluntary exchange and profit and loss rewards the activities and projects that create the most economic value on net. This systematically directs capital to the more productive entrepreneurs. One way it does this is to put capital into the hands of those who use it most effectively. Entrepreneurs with better foresight earn profits, and this attracts more capital. And it does so long as they maintain this record. The entrepreneur is still subject to the test of the market and is still subject to the loss if he fails. A position that is earned must be maintained only by continued success. The ownership of productive assets will then tend to go to those who can use them most effectively. To see how this works, imagine this simple example. Suppose there is a plot of land on the outskirts of a town. An entrepreneur recognizes its potential as cropland and calculates it could generate $50,000 a year in net value. Another entrepreneur sees its potential as an industrial park, netting an expected $100,000 a year as real estate. The entrepreneur discovering the idea that creates the greater value will offer more for the property, and it will go to him. Capital and loan markets facilitate this. The rights to those particular assets or property go to those who can do the most with them. Here's an example. It's seen in ITQs, individual transferable quotas in a fishery. Imagine a commercial fishing ground off of a coast with a population of some valuable species, say halibut. Overfishing can destroy the population. One particular way of preventing this is to establish property rights for individual fishermen or fishing firms called individually transferable quotas, or ITQs. To do this, biologists identify the total allowable catch that can be taken sustainably, that is, without depleting the population in the long run. Each fisherman then receives property rights to catch a particular share or percentage of this total based on his historical share. These property rights can be traded among fishermen. Thus, a fisherman who desires to catch more than his quota can purchase additional rights from other fishermen. A fisherman who is more efficient with lower costs can expand his operation, reducing the cost of fish. For example, suppose the price of halibut at the dock is $7 per pound. Imagine one fisherman's cost average $6 per pound, thus he makes $1 per pound profit. A second fisherman averages $6.50 per pound in costs, making his profit 50 cents a pound. The low-cost fisherman could afford to pay the high-cost fisherman 75 cents per pound for additional shares of quota. Both of them would profit, and the cost of fishing would decline. These cost savings represent real resources saved in production. Thus, this saving means the available resources go farther and are used more effectively. This also helps incentivize everyone to reduce costs. Where systems of individually transferable quotas have been tried, the United States, Canada, Australia, Iceland, and New Zealand, they've increased the value of catch, they've reduced fishing costs, and they've improved fish conservation. Establishing property rights has directed capital to better use and created greater value. Note that this example requires that property rights, the ITQs, be established, and this requires institutional support of government to organize the setting of the total allowable catch and to distribute and enforce the quota shares and trades. Government institutions committed to private property rights and a free exchange are a necessary component of this capitalist system. In addition to directing property and capital to those who can use them most effectively, the profit-loss system also shapes the form and sizes of commercial organization. We see this in economies of scale, the size of enterprises, and economies of scope, that is, which activities an enterprise undertakes and which ones it instead contracts to other suppliers and providers. The modern limited liability corporation, for example, is an innovation that permits thousands of investors to pool their capital and organize firms that can undertake large projects much larger than any individual could. And economies of scale are well understood in manufacturing. A large-scale enterprise can often produce its goods at a lower cost per unit than a small-scale enterprise could. As an example, imagine building a factory for automobile manufacturing, an extremely costly endeavor, and then using it to produce only 10 cars per year. The cost of that factory is spread over just a few vehicles. Now compare that with building a plant producing several 100,000 vehicles annually. Producing at scale greatly reduces per unit costs. Ford's Dearborn truck plant produces 1,200 vehicles per day. Honda's plant in East Liberty, Ohio, produces 240,000 vehicles annually. Those are economies of scale. But economies of scale are limited. As the size of an operation grows, so do the costs of organizing, controlling, and directing it. The optimal size will balance the various sources of cost. The ideal size is not simply an engineering question, and it isn't known in advance without innovation, experimentation, and market feedback. Profit and loss give both the incentive and the signal of the degree of success in developing effective organization and production. Economies of scale also can change the pattern of activity and the structure of the entire economy. Consider American agriculture. In 1900, over 11 million people worked in agriculture, about 40% of the workforce. 100 years later, only 3 million people were involved in farming and ranching, only 2% of America's workforce. And yet, more land was devoted to agriculture, and the value of output in real terms increased over 10 times. The remarkable gains from innovation depend on secure property rights and freedom to trade within the capitalist system. Economies of scope are similarly important. For example, in automobile manufacturing, which parts should a firm make itself and which should it buy from a specialist firm? Or should an agricultural producer process his own output? Or perhaps sell to a processor or middleman? Or maybe even market it directly to the consumer? The question is, what will create the most net value? For all these questions, the answers will vary according to the particular details and circumstances of the product, the time, the place, and many other factors. Here's an example. Sugar beets are a source of refined sugar and related products, but they require substantial processing in order to be useful. Every sugar beet processing plant in the United States is owned by a growers' cooperative, a situation quite different from flour mills that process wheat and other grains. Understanding economics of scope explains why this is so. Processing plants for sugar beets are so specialized that there is little else they can do. Similarly, unprocessed beets have very little value. In this case, divided ownership would potentially create a difficult holdout problem with costly negotiations. Combining production and processing under a single set of owners avoids these costs. It's a cost-effective way of organizing production. On the other hand, with grain and flour production, this problem is far less severe, and divided ownership, with increased specialization and economies of scale in processing, lead to more efficient production.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now.
A similar historical example is found in the auto industry.
In 1916, the company became the Fisher Body Corporation. Its capacity was 370,000 automobile bodies per year. Its customers included Buick, Cadillac, Chalmers, Chandler, Chevrolet, Churchfield, Elmore, EMF.
In the early 1900s, the Fisher Body Company manufactured automobile bodies for every major American manufacturer. This specialization promoted quality in manufacture, but also raised the possibility of holdout problems. A body for a General Motors vehicle, for example, has only one potential buyer, GM. Thus, it made sense for auto manufacturers to take on production themselves. Between 1919 and 1926, General Motors purchased Fisher for its operations. These examples might seem mundane, but economic organization is a crucially important source of economic productivity. They are discovered only by innovation and testing, guided by profit. And because technological possibilities, consumer needs, and other conditions change incessantly, the need for organizational innovation and testing never ends. What are some consequences of all this? It's important to remember why this matters. It might sound as if the concern is simply a little more income in each person's pocket or a little more material wealth. But that's not it. It's far more than that. Let's consider the example of Great Britain, which provides one of the earliest examples of the establishment of modern capitalism. Between 1700 and 2000, the population of Britain grew by a factor of 9. During that period, life expectancy doubled and infant and child mortality plummeted. In 2022, child mortality for England and Wales was approximately 10 per 100,000. In 1700, child mortality in Britain was roughly 30,000 out of 100,000. What about incomes? Average income for a British subject was at least 14 times higher in 2000 than 1700. In the 1,000 years before, population had barely doubled and income changed little. These dramatic changes are not simply the result of scientific breakthroughs. They are the result of the system that allows knowledge to be harnessed to serve people and to create value. The legacy of capitalism is many more human beings living much longer, healthier, wealthier, better lives, with more opportunities to thrive. To see this, consider that the Soviet Union had some of the best scientists and mathematicians, and some of the best theoretical engineers in the world. They had great quantities of natural resources and a well-educated population. And yet, their economy stagnated under a socialist system. Their scientific knowledge was world-class, yet they failed at economic innovation. Without meaningful signals of profit and loss, they could not differentiate value creation from economic waste. It is the economic system and the underlying institutions that provide the framework under which dynamic economic growth can occur. This returns our focus to the importance of the institutions that foster the capitalist system: protected private property rights and the freedom to innovate and exchange, the freedom to direct one's capital and to compete in the marketplace. For the system to work, it is important that each individual be free to direct his capital and abilities to where he thinks best. This harnesses potential entrepreneurial insights from throughout the society. Under these circumstances, individuals and firms compete for factors and for customers, all of it through voluntary exchange, by striving to provide greater net value to others. Making better offers in voluntary trade, that is the essence of market competition. This changes when some firms attempt to block competition through government privilege, rent-seeking, lawfare, and monopoly. Actions that seek to block others from competing have the effect of preventing capital from going to where the entrepreneur believes it will generate the most value. These anti-competitive measures remove the operation of the profit and loss test. They restrict competition and protect the inefficient from competitive pressure. They're wasteful. Consider, for example, monopoly power. Monopoly is not bigness or large size of a firm, nor is it even simply being the single seller of a product. Even a single seller can face competition, or the threat of it, if market entry is open to others. The source of monopoly is in preventing others from developing their capital and their abilities as they choose, thus blocking competition. This nearly always originates from government restriction and privilege. Historically, monopoly restrictions consisted of grants of monopoly, as with royal monopolies in 17th and 18th century France. But today they frequently take the form of burdensome licensing requirements, heavy regulatory burdens, and lawfare. These can be seen, for example, in economies of scale in meeting government regulations. Very large corporations sometimes favor increased regulation because they can afford the legal and accounting teams that small competitors and innovative upstarts cannot. In healthcare delivery, the private practice with an independent doctor is a thing of the past because any medical office today needs an IT department and a legal department simply to comply with regulation. Competition is reduced and costs raised. Antitrust is often proposed as a remedy for monopoly, but it can easily do more harm than good. The rise of those who seek special privileges, protection, subsidy, and the like, those who interfere with the free and voluntary exchange and the allocation of capital in order to obtain personal wealth or power. Economists call this rent-seeking, and it lies behind attempts to restrict or abolish capitalism. Adam Smith termed the system of rent-seeking mercantilism. Today we speak of cronyism, crony capitalism, or, when sufficiently controlled by the government, state capitalism or industrial policy. When completely institutionalized, it becomes socialism. In each case, the essence is rule by elites, government or private, for what becomes their own interests, through the transfers of wealth and the restriction of others. Oftentimes, it will be claimed that this will serve some higher purpose, and perhaps those claims are even well-meant. But this inevitably devolves into a system that transfers wealth to the politically powerful, rather than create wealth for the many. Rent-seeking is the greatest danger to capitalism. We'll return to this in our final lesson, but in our next lesson, we'll consider capitalism and trade on an international scale.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.